It looks like we have lots of you joining us today. I just want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon for our presentation on administrative law job opportunities for young lawyers. This panel will discuss opportunities for lawyers to find administrative law jobs within the federal government. Our panelists will discuss how to search for various jobs, how applicants can effectively tailor their application materials, and how to best present yourself once you've been granted an interview. The panel will be focused towards young lawyers and recent graduates, but this information will be applicable for all attorneys of all experience levels. I'm going to be your moderator for today. And before I introduce myself and the panelists, I just want to let you know that throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A. We're going to save some time at the end of the presentation for questions for our panelists to answer, but just so that you don't forget them as you have them throughout the program, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll keep up with them so that we can make sure that our panelists get a chance to answer them at the end. And again, we thank you for being with us today. My name is Elizabeth Carr, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Career Services at Mercer Law School in Macon. I received my law degree from Mercer back in 2010, and I started in career services about 5 years ago and worked as the assistant director and the director before taking on the assistant dean role. Prior to that, I practiced for about 5 years in South Georgia with a small firm doing a lot of different plaintiffs' work. And now I am really enjoying my time back at my alma mater working in career services and thrilled to be the moderator for this panel today. Our first panelist is Sam Weiss, who currently serves as special counsel at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Previously, Sam worked as a detailee policy analyst at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, where he worked on Office of Personnel Management regulations, including regulations implementing paid parental leave for federal employees. He also previously worked as an analyst at the Congressional Budget Office. Sam graduated from Duke University School of Law and Grinnell College. Our other panelist is Sonya, and she's a 20-year veteran of the legal profession who currently works at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as senior legal counsel to the general counsel for the legal division. Prior to joining that, Sonya practiced in the area of federal labor and employment law, most recently as associate counsel with the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in Dallas, Texas. Sonya has also worked at the Department of Treasury, Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Fort Worth, Texas, first as senior counsel and then as manager of the Labor and Employee Relations Division. She began her legal career at the Federal Labor Relations Authority in Washington, D.C., where she served for 7 years as attorney advisor to then Chairman Carol Waller Pope before joining the General Counsel's office at the United States Patent and Trademark Office in Alexandria, Virginia. So she has a wealth of knowledge from which to talk to us about today. Sonya graduated from Emory Law School and the University of West Georgia. Just before we get started and I turn it over to our panelists, I did want to say that I have this brief disclaimer. The U.S. government disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement of any employee. This panel expresses the panelists' views and does not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government or other members of its staff. The opinions expressed by panelists are those of the individuals and do not represent the positions of the ABA or the administrative law section. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to get us started.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to all the participants in the American Bar Association. Just in general, I want you to be aware that there are tons of opportunities to work for the federal government, and they're not just monolithic opportunities at the Department of Justice and in Washington, D.C. In fact, only about 15 to 20% of all federal jobs are in the DC area. And additionally, according to the Federal Register website, there are over 454 agencies throughout the federal government. With that in mind, it's also there are easier qualifications than a lot of people might think for being a federal employee as an attorney. Specifically, you don't have to be barred in the state where you'll be actually having your job, just have to be barred in one state. And additionally, for people who are recent graduates or even currently in law school who don't yet have their bar license, you are still eligible to even start working as a federal attorney. You just start as what's called a law clerk position. And to go about my background, that's actually what happened to me. I was hired at the SEC right out of law school, actually not as an honors attorney because we didn't have that and still don't actually have an honors attorney hiring yet. But we still hire individual attorneys right out of law school for individual positions. And I was actually given my offer before I took the bar exam. I started my job before I had actually gotten my bar results and been a member of the bar.
So Sam, that would be a point that recent graduates may have, especially in our current circumstances. So if you don't pass the bar the first time, does that affect your position within the federal government?
There's a limit to how long you can serve without passing the bar. So it depends effectively on how long you can find out your results, but effectively you can fail it once.
Okay, thanks.
If your state actually turns around bar exam results really quickly, you could potentially even fail it twice. So with that in mind, also, it's important to know for federal hiring, it's not monolithic. There's not one set hiring practice for the entire federal government. A lot of times federal hiring can be different depending on agency, department, or even individual office within an agency or individual hiring manager. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is generalities, but there might be specifics with each individual agency that are different. Also, it's important to note that attorney positions are what's called accepted service positions. So much of the hiring isn't what you hear about for standard, what's called competitive service. So that means that in the accepted service, which attorneys are, you don't have to have a USA Jobs posting. You don't have to give a points-based preference. You don't have to give points-based preference for veterans preference. You don't have to do any of the normal hiring requirements for federal employees. And in fact, agencies can just directly hire employees without having a competitive process, which happens most often through interns who an agency hires through after graduation. Even with that being said, trying to find an opening, the best way to find an opening is USA Jobs. So let me get out the USA Jobs website that you can see. And USA Jobs is a powerful resource to find out about all jobs in the federal government, but especially attorney jobs. And this is where most of them will be located. To specifically find attorney jobs, you want to search 0905. This is where nearly all the attorney jobs are located except for the administrative law judges and patent attorneys. Once you search there, you'll have a list of all available attorney jobs in the entire federal government that's posted on USA Jobs. You can save this search by clicking here. And then if you log in, you'll be able to set up saved searches that could give you results every day or every week when new federal jobs are posted. Additionally, you can do more selected searches. You, for instance, can add departments by adding, for instance, Department of Justice. And then this will show all attorney jobs in the Department of Justice. You can then again save that search, or if you have terms like, for instance, you're an enforcement attorney, so you can type in enforcement, and that just shows all federal jobs for attorneys that mention enforcement. With that in mind, let's look to an individual posting. So when you're looking at a posting, probably the most important thing is to look at the GS scale. This will be something you can also filter by with the searches. If you go down here, most of the scales for attorneys are going to be GS11 to GS15. GS11 is an entry-level attorney who's just graduated law school, and you can get an additional year, additional GS level for every year of experience post-law school. That being said, that's not necessarily a restriction. If you are a more experienced attorney, you can apply to a job that has a lower pay scale. So for instance, this position that I'm talking about here, if you want to get your inner James Bond on and apply to the National Security Agency, has a GS13. So that means you have to be a second-year attorney. The posting will then show the close date. So make sure you have to apply in USA Jobs before that date. The work schedule full-time, the appointment type, that's most of these are permanent and full-time, the location. And what's also important to hear is to look at the top of the pay scale. So for instance, in this example, the promotion potential is what's called a GS15. What that means is that every year that you have of experience at the job, you can be promoted another GS level without competition. This isn't guaranteed, but many agencies just give it automatically as long as you have a satisfactory review, the grade promotion every year. So after your first year, you'd be a GS14, and then you'd be a GS15. And so this is one of the important things when looking at pay. It's not as important necessarily to look at where you'll be starting at the scale, but what's called the career ladder or the promotion potential of a position.
Sam, this particular job, it looks like it was open a little less than a month. Is there a way to, without just sort of being searching every day to set up any kind of notifications for certain agencies or opportunities so someone wouldn't miss an opportunity that has such a close window?
Yes, that's what you can do through the saved searches. So if you do that search, for instance, in this example for attorneys and then enforcement positions, if you hit save search, and this would be different if I were signed in, you could then have that saved search send an email to you that would give you a notification whenever a new job with those parameters that you specified was posted.
Wonderful, thank you.
So what I just previously showed you was for an individual position. This is another position if you want to, again, get your inner James Bond on and apply to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where this is a position where you'll see a wide range. This is effectively open for 1 year. And what you'll see further down here through the posting is that effectively the office is looking for a wide range of applicants. This isn't for any specific position, but every 2 weeks, actually, anybody who applies will be effectively be put in a resume pool for where then the agency will hire from it. And so that a lot of times the applicant pool will be more broad and that there'll be more offices hiring under it. Additionally, something important to know when applying for these jobs is that this shows the two different types of ways that government agencies will generally seek applicants. The first type is they'll have usually a specific opening, a specific posting, and then in another type, they'll have just general postings that they'll request resumes from, and then individual hiring managers will get all the resumes from those general postings or from resume bank examples. So just because this is the section of administrative law, something I have to point out, this isn't an attorney position, but this is what might be called a JD Advantage position. And this is in the competitive service, so it's a little bit different process. But the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs currently has a job posting right now, right here, which you can go to and apply to if you're interested in a specific regulatory job that isn't necessarily an attorney job, but is a policy analyst attorney preferred job.
And this is one of the fastest growing markets that in career services that we're seeing are these JD preferred jobs. And I would say more than likely this one wouldn't be tied to any kind of bar license, correct? You wouldn't have any sort of parameters on having to pass the bar within a certain period of time.
Correct.
Really?
Yeah. So with that being said, I did talk earlier about how USA Jobs does not have all postings. So here is the website, for instance, where the Department of Justice puts on its own agency website all the openings that it has. And these jobs are not necessarily listed on USA Jobs. So if you are specifically interested in an agency, the number one thing you could do is check that agency's website to see if it has its own careers page with its own openings. There's no set overarching list of which agencies or departments have openings that are on its websites or USA Jobs. Sometimes agencies will use some for one office, another method for another office, or depending on how specialized the position is, and they want a more wider applicant pool, they'll go to USA Jobs, where if they don't want as wide as an applicant pool, they'll post it on their website. So in a lot of ways, this is where networking can help. So that if you network with somebody who, for instance, went to your law school or undergraduate, who works at an agency or department you want to work at, they can tell you the way the agency does postings, so you can hopefully find out about them.
If an agency has something posted on USA Jobs and their own site, should an applicant apply in both places or only one place?
An applicant should apply probably in both places. I know a lot of times if it actually occurs, the USA Jobs posting will actually direct you to the agency website and won't let you apply directly through USA Jobs to prevent any duplications. But if for some reason there is a duplication in that, then I would suggest applying for both. And with that in mind, for my own agency, as an example, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC uses resume banks for a lot of its hirings. And here you can see there's resume banks for actually most divisions in the SEC, where you can send in a resume to an email box for that division. And when that division then has an opening, they'll look at those resumes and then often select somebody from that. With that in mind about the different ways to apply, there are different hiring seasons that the federal government has. Now, the federal government will hire throughout the year, but there's two main times of the year where the federal government will do more hiring than other times. The first time is right at the end of the fiscal year. So at the end of the fiscal year, so basically late September, actually really starting earlier September, a lot of agencies, they have positions and budgets that will end in an office. And so to have a position long-term, they've got to fill it by the end of the fiscal year. And because of that, there'll be a lot of hiring at the end of the fiscal year. And the same reasoning, there'll be a lot of hiring a month or two after most agencies get their appropriations from Congress. That being said, that's not on a set timeline because, for instance, right now, the federal government is working on a continuing resolution. But whenever an agency gets its full appropriations for the year, it then a lot of times will decide, because it knows now how much money it will have for the year, how it wants to spend that money. So specifically, which employees to put in which divisions or offices. And so then those offices will get approval to hire. And so they'll begin posting positions after that process concludes about a month or two after the appropriations is final for an agency. With that in mind, I'd like to also talk about generally how to look at an offer that you get from the federal government and the different parts that are negotiable. So this is a list of all the different locality pays. For example, I'll go to the Washington, D.C. area. And so this will show the different pay rates for instance, a first-year attorney, GS-11, all up to a GS-15. Although note that this is the predominant hiring pay scale for the federal government. Not all agencies follow this scale. For instance, the financial agencies often do not follow this scale. They have a different scale. And additionally, the U.S. attorney's offices do not generally follow this scale. So I talked earlier about the grade increases, that every year you are eligible for one grade increase up until the promotion potential of the position. If you're at the top level of the position or you do not get a grade increase, you are also eligible for a step increase. This is automatic unless you get a really poor annual review. For the first 3 years, if you step 1 to step 2, step 3, step 4, it's every year. Then after that, for the next 3 times, it's every 2 years. Then after that, every 3 years. So this is especially important to note if you're negotiating an offer. So there are a few things you can negotiate with an offer. Generally, your GS level will be set. And there are 2 other aspects you can negotiate. You can technically negotiate under federal regulations for a signing bonus or a relocation bonus. Although those are rarely given, especially for attorney positions. Those are much more often given for positions that are harder to fill, generally more technical skills. But the 2 main things you will be able to negotiate likely are the step you start at and your amount of vacation time. So an important thing to remember about where you start in the step is that you can negotiate especially based upon your current level of experience. So let's say you've graduated law school 5 years ago. You're starting work at the Department of Justice as a GS-15. If somebody had been hired at the Department of Justice as an honors attorney right out of law school, they'd be eligible to be making a GS-15 step 2. So for instance, if you get an offer, you can try to negotiate to say, if somebody starting out with my experience and would be getting a GS-15 step 2, I should get that too. So don't start me at the GS-15 step 1. Along the same lines for vacation time, that's given based upon federal experience. Employees that are starting out get 4 hours of vacation time every 2 weeks or every pay period. Then after 3 years of experience, you get 6 hours. And then after 15 years, you get 8 hours. However, you can negotiate for that. Along the same lines, if you have graduated law school 5 years ago, you have 5 years of experience, you can negotiate with your hiring manager to say that I should be credited for 5 years of experience for vacation purposes, effectively starting at 6 hours of vacation time instead of 4 hours of vacation time every pay period. And these are aspects, I know a lot of hiring managers don't even know about these negotiations and that these benefits that are available, because a lot of time the hiring managers are generally the ones hiring not based upon their knowledge of employment law, but on the person who's actually going to be your supervisor. So if they don't know about it, you can tell them about these benefits. I know most hiring managers are generally welcome to talk about benefits that they can give to their employees, especially because a lot of times the cost of hiring that employee does not come out of their individual budget. All that comes out of their budget is just having what's one slot for that employee. With that in mind, I'll turn it over to Sonya. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And I will be talking about making your application stand out. And then I'll talk a little bit about the interview process. And before I start that, I want to give you a quick disclaimer. This presentation is being made by a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau representative on behalf of the Bureau. It does not constitute legal interpretation, guidance, or advice of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Any opinions or views stated by the presenter are her own and may not represent the Bureau's views. So the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of making your application stand out are a couple of tips that I want to share. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see. So you can see the slides there. And the tips for making your application stand out. So the first thing, we just saw how you can apply for federal jobs through USA Jobs. In USA Jobs, there's an option where you can either use a builder in their system where you can build your resume, or you can actually upload your resume. I always like to see the uploaded resumes in that because they look more similar to what a typical resume looks like. When you use the builder function, it spits it out in a way that's just counterintuitive. So it's not as easy to read, although the information is there and that's fine. But if you want to give a very nice, clean presentation, I would suggest uploading the resume. And then always including a cover letter, and then focusing on your qualifications and skills. And in terms of the cover letter, it's optional, but it is very useful. It gives you the opportunity to speak in depth about your experience and to demonstrate your enthusiasm, passion for the particular area of law that you're applying for and for that particular job. It also just gives the reviewer a preview of your writing style as well, because we don't always ask for writing samples up front. And if they didn't ask for a writing sample, you probably shouldn't just gratuitously send one, but you can send a cover letter because that's more like an extension of your resume. And so that gives them a little preview of how you write. It also can be used to paint a more complete picture of who you are as a candidate. For example, you can add a blurb in your cover letter about why you decided to join the legal profession, or you might have a particular compelling reason for why you want to work at that particular agency. So you would use your cover letter to make those points stand out in your application.
Sonya, I was going to say, we often hear that like your federal resume may need to be a little bit more detailed than some of the others. So would it be helpful for applicants, even if they're uploading their own resume, to look through that resume builder and see the types of information that it's asking for and make sure that their resume, even in their own format, includes all of that, as that may be more detailed than some of the other things they're applying for?
Yes, I think that is a very good suggestion. If you don't use the resume builder, definitely you can go through it. You can go through it and make sure that you're checking off all the boxes, because what you really do want to do also is review that job announcement very closely, because it may have some instructions in there that that you may not think are in there. Like it might actually say you must include a cover letter. In most cases, it's optional, but there are some specific instructions that could be hiding in that job announcement that you might not intuitively think are there. So it's good to review the complete announcement very carefully and make sure that you include everything that you need to include. Thank you for that question. And then in terms of focusing on your qualifications and skills, so what do I mean by that? Here you want to show the hiring official what you are bringing to the table and how you will be an asset to them. By contrast, some job applicants tend to focus on how the job will benefit their particular career goals. And while that may be true, the hiring official will likely be more interested in hearing what you have to offer rather than hearing what you will gain if you're the selectee. So keep that in mind. And then what's the acronym TIPS stand for? In a nutshell, it's tailoring, including specific examples, presenting a polished packet, and being succinct. Now, when it comes to tailoring in application, we're talking about highlighting those qualifications and experience that are, oops, sorry, I moved the, let's go back. There we go. When we're talking about tailoring the application, we're talking about highlighting those qualifications and experiences that are particularly required or useful to the position you're applying for. So one way to do this is to use an objective statement. You can include that statement right at the top of your resume. And for example, if you're applying for a litigation job, you can highlight specific training or experience that you have in litigation in your objective statement right up front. Another way to tailor your application is to specify preferences where appropriate. So for example, if the job includes multiple locations, you can specify which locations you're interested in, or you can also make the point that you're open to any location if that's the case. Some jobs, like what Sam was talking about with some agencies, they might be hiring for multiple positions in multiple divisions in one announcement. So if multiple offices within that agency are hiring under the same job announcement, then you can explain your preference for a particular office or practice area. The default rule, though, would be to highlight those skills that would be attractive for any lawyer to have. For example, like your research skills, your writing skills, your analytical skills, and also diversity in your experience, which could show your agility in different practice areas. Also, I would recommend using language from the actual job announcement in your application packet. And that's because sometimes lawyers are not the first ones to review your application. Human resources personnel might be looking at your application. Some of them might have law degrees, but some don't. So they may not readily be able to translate your resume into what the job announcement says if they don't see that familiar language from the job announcement. So it's nice to be able to highlight that language right in your resume so there is no question about your qualifications. And the next slide here is give examples of your experience performing the duties in the job announcement. So in this case, you want to be very specific. This is where you actually put on your evidence of your qualifications and prove your case. Your goal is to show that you not only have the qualifications to do the job, but that you are the most qualified candidate for the position. So give specific examples where you perform the duties and responsibilities of the job that's in the job announcement at the level that they require. So for instance, one job announcement might be for entry-level attorneys, but say another requires 1 year of litigation experience. It won't be enough for you to just put down that you have litigation experience. You will need to be specific in your examples of litigation and also show that you've been doing that kind of work for that 1 year requirement. And then the other thing is to really take the opportunity to brag a little bit about yourself. If you have received any awards or honors or other accolades, include that information in your application. Some examples would be winning a moot court competition or grading on or writing on to law review, being published in a law journal, or having a particularly high GPA or class ranking. Include all of that information on your resume, because you want to stand out. You want to distinguish yourself from the other candidates. And also, if you participated in any internships or externships or clinics while you're in law school, definitely highlight those things. And if you're still in law school right now and haven't done those things, I would suggest, if the opportunity is there, to go ahead and take advantage of that, because that's just one other thing that you can include on your resume to make your resume stand out from the rest.
Sonya, could a student list certain classes? So let's say they haven't had the opportunity to work in a particular subject matter that's a part of a job description, but they've taken several courses in that and done really well. Could they highlight that on their resume as a way to show some exposure and interest?
Oh, absolutely. I would definitely recommend highlighting that coursework. For instance, I knew that I wanted to do labor and employment law from the time I graduated from law school, and I had taken various courses related to that. So I absolutely highlighted those courses. And you want to try to make sure you do the best you can in those courses too, if that's going to be your preferred practice area. All right. You can still see my screen? Okay, great. The next is present a polished packet. This is where you put the bow on the packet. So lawyers are professional writers, of course, and to be sure to proofread your materials carefully so they're free of grammatical errors and typos. That kind of thing really does stand out. You don't want the person reviewing your resume to be distracted by a careless, simple typo. You want them focused and concentrating on your materials, on your qualifications. So, be relentless about catching those typos and proofreading. I always find it helpful to put it down for a while and go back to it later, a day or two later. Or you can also ask one of your trusted friends or someone you trust to review it and point it out, because sometimes after you've looked at the same thing for so long, you just don't see those things. And it really does matter to people that are reviewing your information. The other thing is explain any obvious gaps in your education or employment. Maybe you took a year off to travel abroad. That's something that you can mention in your cover letter to eliminate any concerns or assumptions that the reviewer might have when they see that gap there. And though not always required, you can include references up front. This, of course, is optional. If the job decides to check your references, they will call you and ask for references. But for time's sake, if they already have it, that's one less thing they have to do. Sometimes it could take a day or two before that candidate is able to be reached, and then get back to them with a list of references. So if you include it up front, all the better. I personally like it when candidates include their references up front. It shows to me a little bit of confidence. It shows that they've already, lined up the people that are going to speak on their behalf. So I would definitely suggest doing that. And then for S, be succinct. Keep your application short and concise. Your resume should be no more than 2 pages. Especially as a young lawyer and as a new lawyer coming out of law school, 1 or 2 pages should do the trick for you. I recommend using bullet points instead of narratives on a resume, because they just give you a very clean line. They're very easy to read, and it shows too how you can get a point across in a very concise way. Don't use a lot of filler words. The reviewer wants to know that you have the experience and the qualifications they're looking for. So use action words instead of a lot of filler and flowery words. So for example, you could say, I defended 7 depositions in a class action lawsuit where the potential liability was $2 million. Or you could say, I'm very skillful at defending depositions in high stakes litigation cases. Well, the second one sounds good, but it really doesn't tell the person exactly what you've done. And so, you want to stick to those facts, and you want to be very succinct when you're doing so. And then your cover letter generally should be about 1 page. I don't really find a need for a cover letter to be more than 1 page at this stage. Include information such as why you're applying for that particular job or to that particular agency, and also highlight particular qualifications and skills that may not be readily observable on your resume, that might not be reflected in a way that you can expound upon in your cover letter. So those are all the tips I have. And now I want to turn and talk a little bit about the interview process. Now, what's interesting is the interview process could be 1 interview or it could be 4 interviews. You don't know what the process is going to be, so be prepared for that. Sometimes agencies will do a screening interview because it is very competitive to get a job in the federal government, because literally we get hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 resumes for 1 position. And so there might be a screening interview where it could be on the telephone. It could be a 15-minute screening interview with staff attorneys or whoever the agency has decided. It could be HR personnel, but they might do some kind of screening to get their list down. And then first round, second round, maybe even a final interview with the big boss, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But often interview panels are used, and they could be used at any of these stages. So panelists may include both managers or non-managers or combination. And then also sometimes you will have a panel that includes stakeholders and or clients. So for instance, in the labor and employment world, because labor lawyers work a whole lot with the labor relations department and agencies, someone from that department may actually be on the interview panel, and that person may not actually be an attorney. What else can you expect from the interview? The interviews are normally structured interviews within the federal government. So a structured interview are interviews where all candidates are asked the same question in the same order. There may be certain follow-up questions depending on your responses, but generally speaking, the questions will be consistent for all candidates. The structured interview questions are designed to assess candidates' qualifications against particular job competencies. And job competencies are just those things that once the person is in the job, their performance rating will be based on those competencies. So for example, the job competency might be analytical thinking. And if so, you might get a question specifically asking you to describe a time where you've had to analyze a complex legal issue. So that'll relate right back to that job competency. And then the panelists, each panelist will give their own score of your answer on that particular question. And when you are answering questions in an interview, it's always advisable to listen very carefully, because there are often multi-part questions being asked. So be sure you hear the question and that you get all of the parts. And it's very acceptable to ask the interviewer to repeat the question. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's also okay for you to not immediately have something to say. It's okay to take a moment to think about the question and to craft your answer in your mind before speaking. Just, a few moments to reflect and to think about the question before you give your example. Moment of silence is not awkward in an interview. It may feel awkward, but it's totally acceptable. In fact, I often think that a person is demonstrating thoughtfulness when they take the time to really hear the question and think about it a little bit before immediately talking. Give specific examples when you're responding to questions. Make good eye contact. Smile, relax, and at the end, be prepared to ask some questions of your own. So do some research about the agency in advance. For instance, if they've been in the news lately, or if they have a big case pending in court, you might impress the reviewers if you've heard about it, or if you've read about it, and then ask a question about it during the interview. But one of the common questions that people ask is for the interviews to say what they enjoy most about working at that agency. And people really do like talking about themselves and talking about their work in their agency. So this question is usually pretty well received. And then finally, after the interview, you do want to promptly respond and thank the panelists for their time in interviewing you. And I say promptly because a lot of times, you never know exactly where you are on a list of candidates. You could be the very last person, and they're going to talk about everybody today once they're finished talking to you. So you want to be pretty prompt about that. And email is fine with that. I think it's probably most acceptable these days. Not a lot of people use what we call snail mail anymore. So it's perfectly acceptable to send a thank you note by email. And if you don't have that person's email right away, whoever set up the interview with you, you can call that person back and get it. Or it's okay to even ask for it during the interview. But I would say don't send a group email. I would recommend that you send to each panelist an individual thank you note. And that way you can personalize it in terms of something that you might have talked about specifically, or a particular question that person asked you. You can reflect on that in your response. Or it's perfectly okay if the thank you notes all say the same thing, but the fact that you sent it to each individual and didn't treat the panel as a group of people and sent it as an individual it just shows a little bit more care and thoughtfulness from that perspective. And then also reflect on what you discussed and how your skills and qualifications make you the best candidate when you're writing out that thank you note. It's for most job interviews, you are able to take some notes, jot some notes down. And if you can, you might want to kind of think about looking at those notes and kind of reflecting on some of the things that you talked about in the interview, and then kind of matching your skills with it to prove your case that you're the best candidate for this job. And then offer to provide any additional information upon request. That's sort of just sort of standard language that folks usually put in there, because at the end of the day, oftentimes they would want to get a little bit more information. Like I said, some folks don't ask for writing samples up front, but after going through a round or two of interviews, they might ask for writing samples. Or like I said, if you haven't included those references up front, they might ask for references. So go ahead and make that offer. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Sonya. We've already had a couple of questions come in, so I'm going to start addressing those so that panelists can answer these questions for you. But if you have questions, feel free to keep sending them into the Q&A or to the chat. First, very quickly, someone wanted to just say that the 0905 or 905 Q code was really helpful as far as limiting that. So that was really just a thank you. But I did want to point that one out. That was sort of given pretty early on, that thank you for that information. We then had a question come in, and this one is obviously very specific to sort of our current world situation, asking if there's a hiring freeze or limited hiring because of the COVID restrictions right now.
Sonya, do you want to take that?
For CFPB, there is no hiring freeze. In fact, we've brought on at least 5 new attorneys in the legal division, and hiring has continued throughout the Bureau.
Yeah. So for some background, just on budgetary matters, agencies that are fee-based, a lot of times now they're having hiring freezes just because if they're a fee-based and they're along with a fee that generally is not being generated because of COVID-19 and the lack of activity, they don't have the funds to hire. But outside of that, agencies that are funded by fees that aren't being affected by COVID-19 or just the general government appropriations process are not really affected as much in their budgetary and hiring needs.
Is there any way for someone to know what that would be, or for an agency that they're interested if that's affecting them?
you can look at USA Jobs or the agency's websites to see if there are openings. Outside of asking somebody, it's hard to know. You could, for each individual agency, you can check their authorization in the most recent Appropriations Act to see how it's funded if you want to, but no uniform way to check that.
So we had another question come in that says, if an entry-level attorney is hired in the appropriation time, does that mean that that hire is a temporary one?
So just in general, I'll go back to the USA Jobs screen. So you're going to see for a position the work schedule. It's whether it's full-time and also appointment type, whether it's permanent. So if it's permanent, that means that you're hired basically until you want to leave or you're fired or something really bad happens. Generally, whenever an attorney position is posted, it's going to be permanent. There are some types of positions that are called temporary. That means that they last for as long as the agency specifies, to, under current regulations, a maximum of 4 years. Although those are usually more technical positions, and it's rare for any attorney position to be temporary. If it's posted, it's permanent. And that's why agencies usually wait to the end of the appropriations process so they know how much money they have, so they can actually ensure that they have the money to spend on a permanent position.
Thank you. Sonya, this question was specifically directed to you. Someone said, as an older law student with a lot of professional work experience prior to law school, I found this a hindrance when looking at legal jobs. How do you recommend someone like me revise their resume to include my experience, but show that I am just as valuable as a younger lawyer?
That's a good question. I actually had 3 years of work experience before going to law school. So I had, other jobs too. I would say kind of tailor it down. You might want to put your you might want to just leave it off altogether to start with, and start with your legal career. If with your legal education up front, you can organize your resume in a way to highlight the legal aspects, and then at the bottom, like I was talking about with the bullets, using the bullet kind of section up top where you're talking about your legal education and experience. And then when it comes to the experience that you think might be a little less relevant, but still kind of paints a clearer picture, you can kind of do it more in a narrative form. And then also thinking about what skills did you take from those other positions and that other experience that might be relatable, and kind of connecting it that way as well.
Thank you. So we had another question come in.
You're welcome.
And again, this may be relevant specifically now, but I know a lot of times these initial screening interviews can be virtual or by phone. So is there anything different that a candidate should expect by doing a virtual interview that may be different than if they're doing it in person? Or can you speak to sort of that in general with virtual interviews and sort of how that's affecting the hiring process currently?
Yes, I can speak to that. They are very much the same. The expectation is the same in terms of your appearance. If you would wear a suit to a job interview normally, I would suggest you continuing to do that. The only difference is video as opposed to sitting right up front. So, the one thing that you can't do is make direct eye contact, but you can look into the camera. And so that really does help. But I say really treat it like a regular interview.
And for the most part, have your offices been using Zoom? So I know there's other technologies where you sort of get like a pre-recorded, your student sort of, or an attorney's having to record their answers, and it's sort of through a software where there's not, someone sort of on the other side. For the most part, have you seen that the government's just using, Zoom or sort of live like we're doing now, interviews for virtual purposes?
Yes, for our agency, but not Zoom. We have WebEx and Teams, and I can't remember if we're using the WebEx or the Teams for the external. I believe it's the WebEx for the external.
But those are live,
but
not like the pre-recorded.
They're live, exactly.
And it's the same.
A little bit different to prepare for, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Sam, I cut you off.
And it's the same for the SEC.
Okay.
Although I should specify, just because I think that's a general practice, but that doesn't mean some agencies aren't doing something different.
Thank you. So we had another question come in that says, can state government experience be seen as a competitive advantage for federal employment?
So let me just start by saying, when a lot of people talk about competitive advantages, especially the competitive service, I just want to clarify what that means. There are certain types of experience where basically by regulations, you're what's called a status candidate. So you're in the preferential pool. For instance, certain veterans preference, being a current competitive service employee. And for that purpose, because lawyers are accepted service, that doesn't apply. And also state government experience wouldn't apply for that. But when just like looking at accepted service, what a hiring manager might want to see, that's definitely a beneficial experience. I know something, especially at the Securities and Exchange Commission, there are a lot of people who want to work at the SEC for about 2 to 3 years. They're current big law firm associates. And then after they have that experience, they want to become partner at a law firm. So basically the SEC employment is a tool for them to become partner. And generally the SEC, and I think most federal agencies, want to hire people who show a commitment to the job and to the service. And state government experience definitely shows that. And additionally, there are a lot of jobs only governments do, and you can only get that experience by being a state government employee or a federal government employee.
Great. We had another question come in, and again, feel free to keep sending them into the Q&A or the chat. Does a clerkship count as experience as far as the graded levels?
Any legal experience counts to be eligible for a higher grade level. So if you have 1 year of a clerkship, you can get to GS-12. Although I should specify, I believe you don't have to have a law degree to do a clerkship. And if you don't have a law degree, you might have trouble convincing the human capital officer that was actually legal experience, even though it was a legal job, because you didn't have a law degree then.
But post-grad clerkships that someone's doing after they graduate from law school, that would count.
Yes.
As long as you make sure to have your law degree. Because I do know examples of people who did a clerkship and I said the wrong thing, the bar exam, passed your bar. I don't mean law degree. You definitely have your law degree. But as long as you passed your bar exam, because I do know some people who have done a clerkship who didn't pass their bar exam, they wait until afterwards, and then you might have a tough time convincing the human capital officer that you actually had a year legal experience because you hadn't passed your bar exam.
I was going to ask about those clerkships that you don't have to have a law degree for.
Ask
how we have those.
Thank you for catching me.
We've had another question come in, and I think this one's a great one, something I would definitely ask, and for career services purposes. Is there anything that either of you panelists would wish you had done differently or known about as a first-year law student to set yourself up for a job at a federal agency?
I can speak a little bit about that. I think what's been shared here in terms of USA jobs, just that knowledge alone, I wasn't aware of exactly how to go about finding federal, like particularly targeting federal jobs, and kind of knowing the different agencies and the different practice areas is beneficial as well. And the other thing that Sam shared earlier about being able to negotiate your salary and your potential leave, that's definitely some good knowledge. So I think just by attending this presentation, you're already setting yourself up for success.
Yeah. So one thing, I know my situation turned out well, but just a caveat I want to say that I see sometimes with people who are seeking federal employment, they go all into federal employment at maybe one agency or federal employment in general. So for instance, I know some people who have done internships at the SEC, multiple internships in different divisions, or multiple internships at the federal government and not having try to go work at a firm job or something like that. And just understand you're taking risks when you do that. So for instance, I know we had people in 2016 who were our summer interns. We wanted to hire them, but we couldn't because there was a hiring freeze at the beginning of 2017. And those are situations like that you can't necessarily predict. And so you might be able to do everything right and still not be able to get a federal job, at least initially after graduation. So just understand those risks. Also, additionally, federal hiring typically happens much later in the process. There still are internships and there's honors positions, but most of the federal hiring happens later than a firm hiring would happen. And it's hard for me to argue that you should put all your marbles in government hiring when you have to give up the option of a firm. And you don't know if because there isn't congressional funding or an administration wants to not hire any new employees, that even if an agency wants to hire you, they might not be able to.
So while it would be helpful to have those experiences on your resume, you shouldn't sort of go all in necessarily. It's good to have a good diverse resume with lots of different experiences.
Yes.
Great. So we've had a couple more questions come in, and I appreciate it. Keep sending them in. One question just came in that says, if you have a current GS level in a term position, once that term ends, can you apply for a higher GS level at another federal job? For example, if an applicant is a current GS 12, can the applicant apply for a position that is equivalent to a GS 14, i.e. skipping one level?
So I'll give a lawyerly answer. This will be facts and circumstances based. So to be eligible for the GS 14 level, you have to have 1 year of experience at the GS 13 level. Your experience at the GS 12 level, I believe you said you're a GS 12 right now, will not count for that. But if you have some other experience that you can argue is at the GS 13 level for 1 year, you will be eligible for the GS 14 level.
Perfect. I think that was helpful to have. We like to preface. Let me give you my lawyer answer. We had a question come in about social media. So does having a social media account affect hiring, for example, like LinkedIn, which I would say LinkedIn is sort of its own beast of burden, but does having social media, or when you're applying for different federal positions, do they look at your social media accounts?
So I can talk a little bit about with respect to LinkedIn. I know that we often share information about job announcements via LinkedIn, but that's really for the purpose of getting the announcement and the opportunity out there. It's not to, kind of inspect a person. When making the hiring decisions, you really look at the candidates and what they put forth in their hiring package. So, what's going on their social media accounts or anything like that, that's not something you would look at as you're assessing an application.
I'm going to put my career counselor hat on, though, and say always be aware of what you have out there on your social media, because it could affect your ability to get hired for a position, or it could affect your ability to maintain a position once you have it.
For sure.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, because, of course, with some positions, there are background checks, and those things might come up in a background check.
Sure.
So while it might not impact a hiring decision, it may be impactful in other ways if there's something negative out there.
So someone just wanted to say that they wanted to say thank you for such an informative and insightful presentation. And I have covered all the questions that have come in so far, but feel free to send in. We've got a couple more minutes left. While I'm waiting for any other questions to come through, is there anything else either of you would like to add, panelists? And I'll keep watching just in case somebody else pops one more question in the Q&A or chat.
Just like that, I think this summarizes a lot of what I talked about, is that especially for attorney positions, because they're accepted service, that attorney hiring for the federal government in a lot of ways is similar to hiring for any other job. It's going to be very different based upon which agency you're applying, much like it'll be different based upon each law firm. And each hiring manager might be looking for a very different thing. And additionally, because the way the offers of how they're posted, a lot of times networking can help, not necessarily in getting the job, but finding out about the job.
And the thing that I would say, thank you for the person that even brought up the LinkedIn. I would say, get on there and do some networking. A lot of times, because these jobs are accepted service jobs, sometimes that means, sort of in layman's terms, you can just hire someone off the street, so to speak. So sometimes before a job announcement is even posted, sometimes they won't be posted, and it would have come through in that way. Now, that's not that's something that can be done. I don't know how frequently it's done, but the point is that get out there and network, get to know people, talk to people who do what you want to do, and don't undervalue the benefit of having a mentor as well.
That's the lovely bells that we have here at the law school. So I apologize. Hopefully those aren't too loud. I love how engaged our participants are. We had a couple of more questions come in, panelists, if you've got just another second. So one, which I think is really helpful to go ahead and cover, is someone wanted to know if they wanted to contact you with further questions. Is there a way for them to do so? They wanted to say thank you so much for an awesome presentation. I believe it's being recorded and will be, I don't want to say this out of turn, but like maybe made available as a part of this program. But I don't want to take away the panelist opportunity to say that you could find them on LinkedIn or some other way if someone had questions.
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn for sure.
Yes, same thing.
And then we had some more technical questions come in. Does your chances of getting hired increase if you already work for the federal government in a different capacity?
It is definitely.
Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, it's definitely a positive factor. It's not anything that you get points based, much like in the competitive service. It actually is an advantage where you'll get special status if you are a current federal employee in the competitive service. But that said, hiring managers like people generally that have federal government experience, because that especially shows the interest in the federal government and in the mission.
I concur with that answer.
And then we had another question come in that says, as I understand, executive agencies and commissions have different scales, GS versus GG. Do both scales directly relate equivalently?
So I'm not familiar with the GG scale. Most scales, if they're numbered 1 to 15, they are equivalent with the GS scale except for pay. I know there's especially some scales, the CFPB, with my co-panelists, that does not have the 1 to 15 scale. And that relates in a way that I'm not sure, but it does have similar requirements for each grade.
Yes, and we actually, in our job announcements, we kind of explain what the equivalent GS would be in the job announcement itself. So for instance, if you apply for a CN53 position, say for instance, then it will tell you in the job announcement equivalent, or I don't know if that's the exact word, but it'll mention the equivalent GS. And I believe for 53, the equivalent would be a GS 13. But it'll say it right in the job announcement, so you don't have to be confused about it.
Yeah, I know, for example, the SEC has an SK scale that's like the GS scale 1 to 15, and an SK 11 is the same amount of experience you need as a GS 11. SK 12 is the same amount of experience you need as a GS 12, like that, et cetera. They're basically, the numbers are equivalent.
So it sounds like it's really helpful if you do know somebody within an agency, if you can network your way to sort of having that contact, if you have any confusion over these, because you both were able to explain it. So someone within the agency may be able to sort of give you more information if it's not clear based on sort of what you're seeing at that point. That's all the questions that have come in at this point. Another person wanted to chime in and say, great panel, thank you so much. I want to say thank you both to both of you as well. This was incredibly informative from a career services perspective. Even when we were running through yesterday, I was making notes to share with our students and our young alums, and I shared this opportunity with our young alums, to watch today. So I wanted to say thank you as well. It was super informative. We're just a few minutes over 6 o'clock. I gave you the chance to wrap up, but it's so good, I wouldn't want to take it away again. So if there's anything else you want to tell our participants before we sign off for the evening.
Just thank you. Thank you for participating. You're making a great step by attending these types of forums. And again, get out there and meet people, network, and knock it out. Good luck.
And thank you for the ABA, Chris Walker, and Ann Kiefer for all the work they've been doing in helping set up this conference.
And we had another question about how can they contact you. So I just wanted to remind you, they said you can find them both on LinkedIn. I looked at their profiles before the panel, so they're pretty easy to find if you search by their name. And I'm sure they would appreciate if you go to connect, you can put that you saw them on the ABA panel today. And so they would say you could definitely contact them that way. Thank you again so much, and I think that will conclude our panel.
Great. I just wanted to add my thanks. This has been an absolutely amazing panel, and I know the students and the young lawyers will appreciate this. So thanks so much for taking the time this evening to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.